I'm joined here in the studio now by Ehud Barak, who until earlier this year was the Prime Minister of Israel, by James Rubin, who was President Clinton's Assistant Secretary of State, and by Rosemary Hollis of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Mr. Barak, first of all, should we see this as an act designed to draw attention to what is happening in the Middle East, or should we see it as something quite separate from that?
It's clear that the whole Western civilization is at war with world terror. It might have some kind of indirect relationship to something that happened either in Afghanistan or somewhere else in the Middle East, but this is not the case. Once they are ready to hit the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, it means that we are basically at war. And I'm fully confident American people, which is a tough and courageous people, and have tough leadership at the helmet, they will know how to fight back. And I believe that leaders all around the world, here in the UK, in Europe, in Russia, the Russians will fully cooperate with this. Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Israel, of course, and others should join hands to defeat terror, period. We cannot afford this kind of threat to our whole way of life.
I'll come back to that point in a moment. I want to bring in Frank Gaffney, who's the director of the Center for Security Policy, who's in Washington. How do you think the United States will respond to this? And are you surprised, as an expert in security matters, that nobody had any inkling of what happened?
Well, to answer the second question first, I'm not frankly surprised, because this is precisely the way the cells that we're up against here, and perhaps their state sponsors, are organizing themselves and conducting their activities. It is purposely designed to keep the lowest possible profiles, avoid signatures, as they say in the intelligence business, and conduct their affairs in such a way that we won't know what's happened to us until it has happened. As to how the United States will respond, it remains to be seen, of course. My hope is that, as any number of people have said on this program and elsewhere here in Washington in recent hours, the United States is at war now. And I hope that the President will respond appropriately and accordingly. This is not a matter for business as usual, a judicial process, forensic investigations, and so on. I believe that we have been struck in a way that is probably going to be a precursor to even worse. And it is time for us to act as I think our friends in Israel have been doing for some time, quite correctly, which is to use such intelligence as we do have, to use such force as we have at our disposal to strike at and try to destroy these terrorists and their sponsors before they strike again.
But do you know who they are?
We probably won't know, if at all, for some time with precision who is responsible for this precise attack. Therefore, I would go after everyone who is engaged in terrorist acts against us, everyone who has made known their determination to do harm to the United States. I think we ought to use this as an opportunity, as has been pointed out by others, to put them on the run. Let them know that they've got no place to hide, and such places that they hide are going to be very difficult places from which to operate against us.
We heard earlier on that the United States security in airports was rather lax because there was a feeling that this was the kind of thing that couldn't happen. There have obviously been terrorist incidents in the United States, but compared with the way that terrorism is expected in Europe and in the Middle East, in the United States it's not thought likely. Has this been, in that sense, a big shock? And will the scales fall from America's eyes about their vulnerability after this?
Well, I hope the scales are falling from our eyes as a people about our vulnerability in the largest sense. We are, in fact, a target for others' enmity, and they are using the means they have to, and they apparently are going to be a larger and larger set of means with ever more deadly possible effects, including, I have to tell you, missiles that are, I'm afraid, being acquired by some of the same states, some of the sponsors of terrorism, and perhaps even some of the organizations that we're worrying about today. Vulnerability is something this country can no longer afford, either to missiles or to these other kinds of terrorism. Clearly, security at the airports in this country has to be improved. It's been said that some of the employees currently engaged in doing these security searches have actually been wooed away by the fast food industry, which tells you something about the quality and the pay scales that we've been giving to people doing this job. That probably will end, I hope.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kafney. James Rubin, you heard what Ehud Barak said a moment ago about the nature of this terrorism and it being everybody's enemy. If there were peace in the Middle East, would this have happened?
Well, I think the short answer is yes. During the time when Prime Minister Barak was in office, or even before him, when the peace process was fairly optimistic, people thought the Oslo process was working. 1993 was the time when the Oslo process was at its highest, and in 95 and 96, when we had great optimism between Israel and the Palestinians, Osama bin Laden was attacking the United States and attacking American interests. He's not interested in peace in the Middle East. He's interested in destroying what is the civilized world. And so I think we shouldn't get our apples and our oranges mixed up. Osama bin Laden is not doing this for the Palestinians. When the Palestinians and the Israelis were closest to peace, Osama bin Laden was still going about his dirty business.
So how do you see this as a one-man campaign, obsession with the destruction of America? I mean, it almost beggars belief that one person can get this kind of, without any other rhyme or reason, can get this scale of operation to go, and people to commit suicide themselves in order to achieve his ends.
Well, clearly, when we say Osama bin Laden, we need to think a little bit larger than that. What we're talking about is a loose group of organizations funded throughout the Arab world and other parts of the Muslim world who have seen Osama bin Laden as a figurehead. But these are all people who reject the Western civilized way of life. These are people who believe that the United States is the root of evil. And when you see an attack on the symbol of civilization in Europe, in all the world, which is the World Trade Center, it's not the Pentagon. All the people of the world operate through the World Trade Center. They're going to be Japanese, they're going to be Africans, they're going to be Latin Americans, they're going to be Europeans who are in there working today, who are going to be dead because of Osama bin Laden. He's attacking all the civilized world, and what he's about is being opposed to civilization. It's not about the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. It's about Western civilization as we've come to know it and love it, and because we believe in freedom, we have a society that is going to always be a little bit lax unless we're going to go to extreme measures, which I don't think we'll ever take.
Do you agree with this?
Well, I think there's a concern here because we're building a case during the course of this program which leans heavily on the verdict that taking it out in retaliation on Osama bin Laden will be the appropriate way to respond. Now, I imagine that means a bombing raid on Afghanistan. What about all those poor Afghans who have nothing to do with Osama bin Laden and who would not be willing supporters of the Taliban government even in Afghanistan if they had any choice? This means, in the terminology of war, collateral damage. This in itself is not resolution of a problem, it's building more hatred and the perception that the United States wields power without compunction. That is something to be aware of.
Okay, Ehud Barak.
I don't think that the collateral damage is the real issue at stake now. Look at the collateral damage, so to speak, that had happened in the United States. We are dealing with a world effort, not necessarily Osama bin Laden himself. We all know the names of rogue states: Iraq, Iran, North Korea, Gaddafi to an extent, maybe one more. We all know the names of rogue leaders and the name of thugs of terror. And their names are known to the MI6, to the CIA, to the BND, the CM Bureau. And there is a need for joint effort, diplomatic, economic, intelligence-wise, and operation-wise, the same way that our ancestors fought against the piracy on the high seas. No airport and no port terrorists should be allowed to land, and whoever hosts them or directly or indirectly support them should be automatically isolated from the community and family of nations. This is the only way. Without this clarity of purpose, there will be no world order possible, period.
Well, we're talking about declaring war, and you're talking about doing it in protection of democracy, and you're talking about sacrificing some of that democracy in the prosecution of that war.
Weapons these days are accurate enough. It's not a matter. I don't want to go into the operational details. Once there is a will, a clear will of world leadership to put an end to it, it will take a lot of painful moments, ups and downs, and even tough moments like this one, but we will prevail and democracies will overcome this phenomena of terror within 10 years.
Okay, let's pause there and go back to Tom Carver, who we were hearing from a moment ago, who's been in Washington all day, and here's his report on the latest events there.
The American Airlines plane slammed into the ground floor of the Pentagon. It was less than an hour after the World Trade Center attack. All 6 stories of the building on one side were destroyed, leaving a massive hole in the military headquarters of the world's superpower. Stunned 3-star generals and clerks were herded into surrounding car parks, which were turned into emergency medical centers. The Air Force was activated to shoot down any other plane which came close. This is the first attack on the Pentagon in American history.
You could tell it was like a suicide bomber. But I'm not saying it was a bomb, but, you know, it was a plane. And it just came, it came streaking down and it hit short. It didn't go into the top of the Pentagon. It came like in short, and then everything sprayed up, like a fireball sprayed up on the wall.
A quarter of an hour later, a 757 crashed into a field close to Camp David, the president's rural retreat. The president himself was hundreds of miles away in Florida, about to talk to some school children, when his chief of staff, Andrew Card, whispered the news to him. Minutes later, he was boarding Air Force One. Instead of returning to Washington, he went to an Air Force base in Louisiana.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Team, and my cabinet. We have taken all appropriate security precautions to protect the American people.
Washington itself has been virtually sealed off from the outside world. Every federal office has been closed, thousands of workers sent home. Even Congress has been evacuated and shut.
It's another Pearl Harbor for this country. And I gathered my staff and we calmly held a prayer meeting, and then I told them to go home.
Across the country, banks and schools have been ordered to close. Inner cities are deserted. Many parts of the country have declared states of emergency. There is no air traffic over America at present. All planes have been ordered to land at the nearest airport. A nationwide appeal for blood has gone out. In several cities, the phone networks have been frozen. Here on the eastern seaboard, the motorways are clogged with traffic. If it was the terrorists' intention to sow confusion and panic in America, at least on this day, it would seem they succeeded. Tom Carver, BBC News, Washington.
And now we join Paddy O'Connell again in New York with the latest news of what's happening there. Paddy.
I think, David, what's becoming clear is that this is not over. That is to say, if you look at the pictures of Manhattan, downtown where it happened, the mayor has evacuated part of Lower Manhattan. That will be no surprise. But if you think back a step as to why, it's because buildings remain unstable. This is the scene around the building that collapsed, but the question being asked is, what about the buildings that were standing immediately after it? Now, I don't, where I'm sitting in Midtown Manhattan, have an answer to that question, but I'm afraid this question is the one that's preoccupying us, because underneath the rubble is the answer to the question, how many people have lost their lives? We know there are displaced people. We know there are disgusted people all across this country, and here there are people trying to get home. But as I speak to you, David, we don't know the answer to the question of the scale of the human tragedy. The analysis, important as it is, will be had, but the figures on people, we just don't know.
What sort of flow of information is there? You say nothing is really known, but is everybody Is information still coming out from the World Trade Center down there?
We have an unconfirmed report of a building collapse. At times like this, you want to hear directly from the city authorities. I passed one of the major hospitals 4 hours ago. They were shouting for blood donations in the street. And about half an hour later, many of us were reporting that they were looking for blood across the city. So it's a very much of an immediate return to the most basic way of communicating in a city of this scale. People are confused as much as they are disgusted. People are dead and people don't know about it. So there is a stoicism here. I would say we would be clinging to the word panic and forgetting that people are getting on with it, clearing it up, and angry. But equally, we are focusing in the attention now on what's under that rubble. And here, the situation on Times Square, I don't know if we can bring you, David, the picture behind me. This was full earlier of people. It's now deserted. This makes me think people are heading home. I'm concluding this because one avenue is shut behind me, 7th Avenue, but this was full of around 500 people 3 hours ago. Where have they gone? We think they've gone home, and we don't know the answer to that either.
And is there a feeling that America will be able to revenge this in some way, or indeed prevent its happening, anything like it happening again? Or are people fatalistic about it?
I think a shock has turned to anger already. I heard the first mention of Pearl Harbor, was from a man on the street down here. Then we spoke to a foreign policy expert, and you're surrounded by many names that will be familiar around the world, of course. But the person that we were speaking to saying, America will respond to a moment in time. This is a moment in time. It will be hard for the president to resist some kind of call for action from the world's richest democracy. The question is, of course, and it's not for me to answer what action that will be, but yes, the word on the street from people I've spoken to is they do want action.
Paddy O'Connor, thank you very much indeed for that report. Well, there have been comparisons between today's events and the impact on the United States of Japan's surprise attack at Pearl Harbor in World War II. We've heard that said several times during this program. The difference is that then there was an enemy. To suffer the shock without knowing who's responsible or how to retaliate creates confusion and panic, which is exactly what the perpetrators of this atrocity intended. September the 11th, 2001, will be remembered as an attack not just on the United States, but on the very concept of a secure and orderly world, an attack on all of us. Coverage continues now on BBC News 24 with my colleagues Carrie Gracie and Gavin Esler.
There's another one. I'm taking a look.
Oh! Oh my God! Oh, jeez! Oh my God! My own eyes.
The United States under attack. 3 hijacked planes crash into the heart of American power. 2 rip through the twin towers of the World Trade Center. The devastation after both towers collapse, the extent of casualties is still unclear. Then, Washington, another plane crashes into a defense building at the Pentagon. Welcome to BBC World News. I'm Philip Hayton. Heavy loss of life and catastrophic destruction. That's the scene on the streets of New York after the United States suffers what many are saying is the worst attack on the country since Pearl Harbor. A huge operation is underway to find survivors from the wreckage of both towers of the World Trade Center in New York. They collapsed after hijacked airliners with passengers on board were flown into them. And part of the Defense Department, the Pentagon near Washington, continues to burn after another hijacked airliner plunged into it. The mayor of New York has said the casualties will be more than any of us can bear. There are no indications so far of who is behind the attacks. President Bush said those responsible would be hunted down. Our correspondent Mike Wooldridge has been following the day's events.
America's vulnerability to terrorism has never been exposed like this. The second hijacked plane flies into one of the twin towers of the World Trade Center and a fireball erupts around the 110-story building. The other tower was already ablaze after being hit by another plane only minutes earlier.
Oh my God!
one plane and one tower might just have been a terrible accident. That possibility was blown apart with the second direct hit. New Yorkers assumed they were reliving the 1993 bombing of this, one of the most famous landmarks of the capitalist world, but this was to be infinitely more audacious. Some of those trapped inside went to desperate lengths in the hope of rescue. The same desperation led others to jump to an inevitable death. There was pandemonium and panic in the streets around the Trade Center as the authorities tried to marshal people away from the area.
There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
Within the hour, one of the huge towers constructed to withstand all but the most apocalyptic of events collapsed.
Thanks very much.
Completely collapsed.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
The attack was too devastating for the second tower as well, and not long after it too collapsed, filling the streets with yet more debris and dust. Thousands worked in these towers. No one had any idea how many casualties there were, but that they were mounting horrifically was obvious. The mayor of New York predicted that the death toll would be tremendous and ordered the evacuation of South Manhattan. Its streets took on an eerie appearance now as stunned people tried to make their way to safety. But the terrorists, it seems, had other designs. The very heart of the US defense establishment was another of their targets. A third hijacked plane came down in a steep descent over Washington and crashed into the side of the Pentagon, setting off another huge blaze. Apparently, the evacuation of the building had been ordered a few minutes before, but had barely started. A fourth airliner came down in Pennsylvania, some 80 miles from Pittsburgh. This was the scene at the aftermath of that crash. By now, Americans were starting to portray it as the worst attack on their country since Pearl Harbor. In the space of a few hours, the landscape of New York had been changed in an apparently coordinated attack that could barely have been imagined. The symbols of the devastation were as powerful as the devastation itself. Mike Wooldridge, BBC News.
Reaction to the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon have come from leaders around the world. Geeta Gurumurthy has this report.
Housing one of America's key enemies, the Taliban regime has denied Osama bin Laden was the man behind today's horrific events. The Taliban ambassador to Pakistan condemned what he called the terrorist attacks and said they don't allow bin Laden to use the asylum of Afghanistan against any country. If it's not bin Laden, there's speculation it could be a new deadly mix of disaffected Islamic groups. Today, the UN Secretary General said the world is traumatized.
There can be no doubt that these attacks are deliberate acts of terrorism, carefully planned and coordinated. And as such, I condemn them utterly. Terrorism must be fought resolutely wherever it appears. In such moments, cool and reasoned judgment are more essential than ever.
From the Middle East to Asia and Europe, world leaders have joined in condemnation. The Russian President Vladimir Putin said his people felt the pain of the Americans. He said today had proved the need for Russian plans for an international fight against terrorism. Britain too joined in the call for mass condemnation against an attack of mass terrorism.
This is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism, but between the free and democratic world and terrorism.
NATO called an emergency meeting. Armed forces are on alert, but it's still not known who carried out this atrocity.
The Americans don't know, we don't know, but the clear message to whoever it was is that they will have left a trail behind them. and they can be assured that they will be found. And the international community, the whole international community, will be united in condemning what they've done and making sure that they're not in a position to do it again.
Governments everywhere are dazed by the destruction. From Iran, Syria, China, Ghana, words of condemnation. And from Cuba and South Africa, offers of humanitarian aid. And whilst the Bush administration may have incurred increasing wrath, especially in the Muslim world, the question remains, if America is this vulnerable, is anyone safe? Geeta Gurumurthy, BBC News.
Amid the chaos, the FBI and its international partners are already trying to work out who could be capable of planning attacks on this scale. Very few groups are thought to have the capability needed, and the Saudi rebel Osama bin Laden is one. He's currently in Afghanistan, where the ruling Taliban claimed today that he was not capable of an attack of this size. But according to Islamic Jihad, the attacks were a consequence of United States policy in the Middle East. James Robbins now on the search for the guilty men.
In the Arab quarter of Jerusalem, they're celebrating the massacre and mayhem in the United States. What's a disaster to much of the world is seen as a triumph by some. It's evidence of how much hatred has already been refueled by this disaster. Now American intelligence, which missed stopping the attacks, will desperately be searching for the culprits. And to find who's behind it, they'll first ask, how was it done?
I think it's almost impossible to believe that a hijacker could convince an American domestic airline pilot to commit suicide by flying into the World Trade Center. I have absolutely no doubt at all they had trained pilots. We know in the past that they've had pilots who have been perfectly capable of flying aircraft, and this can only be the only, I think, answer to this. American pilots would not do this, but Arab fundamentalists may well be prepared to.
Number one suspect has got to be this man, Osama bin Laden, the richest and possibly the most ruthless terrorist in the world. Bin Laden has declared the destruction of the United States his top priority. He heads and pays for an extraordinary international network of Islamic militants. Whatever the response, Osama bin Laden is already accused by the United States of bombing 2 of its embassies in Africa in 1998. 224 people were killed, including 12 Americans. It's only 3 months now since 4 Islamic extremists were convicted of those bombings by a court sitting in New York. Osama bin Laden was named by American federal prosecutors as the mastermind of these killings and a string of other attacks. Bin Laden is also suspected of involvement in this previous attack on today's major target, the World Trade Center. This bombing in 1993 killed 6 people and blew a 60-foot hole through 4 basement levels of the building. And this evening, many Palestinian and other Islamic militant organizations are distancing themselves from today's attacks. Perhaps they're fearful of American retaliation. A leading Middle East analyst in Britain hopes the blame won't fall on the entire Arab world.
It will stigmatize many, many innocent people, law-abiding people who have settled in the West. But what can states do? You've got to be practical.
Before today, the worst terrorist attack inside the United States was the Oklahoma bombing of 1995. And it was an American, Timothy McVeigh, who was convicted and executed for that mass killing. But tonight, nobody seriously believes Americans have been killing their own. And the mastermind for these latest attacks is being sought outside America's borders. James Robbins, BBC News.
President Bush was not in Washington when these attacks took place. He was on a visit to Florida, and he didn't return to Washington, presumably because they feared further attacks, possibly against the White House. He moved on to an Air Force base in Louisiana and then on to another Air Force base in Nebraska, where he's been for the past few hours. And the news agencies are reporting that he has made a statement there deploring what he called the acts of a faceless coward, and he's commanded the United States military to high alert status worldwide. And according to his press secretary, Art Fleischer, the president will be returning to the White House later today, Tuesday. A short time ago, I spoke to the Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres in Jerusalem about today.
You know, it's like a Pearl Harbor, like a new form of a war or like a terrible new arm, and we have to take it very seriously. Our hearts is clearly with the people of the United States, but this was not an attack just upon America. It was an attack upon civilization, upon humanity, an attempt to introduce the jungle as the rule of our time and our days. And I think we have to take it very seriously. We are going over from a world of enemies and armies to a world of dangers of a global nature without strategies and without organizations. We have to get ourselves organized. Now, as we feel so deeply with the United States, we know that the United States is determined and strong and will take again the lead to guarantee freedom, to enable people to fly safely, to walk in the streets unthreatened, and really to bring us back to normal life.
Now, as a country, Israel has often been on the receiving end of attacks, although nothing as spectacular as this. What sort of advice would you give to Washington?
To organize it globally in both directions, to identify every country that hosts or supports terror or terrorism, to stop it, otherwise they will be declared as a country of terror with all the consequences. Secondly, to call upon all leaders of religion and culture to stand up and declare themselves against this phenomena of suicidal terror, because it's becoming one of the greatest dangers of our time. It goes against the gospel, and the clergymen have to call each in his own religion to put an end to it.
One final question, Mr. Peres. Many people suspect a Middle East dimension to these attacks. Do you think there's a possibility that American public opinion might want to disengage from the Middle East because they see it as too risky now for America?
I don't think it has to do with the region. It has to do with the form of confrontation and war. There were acts of terror in the United States disconnected with the Middle East, and there are terror in many other places all over the world, including Turkey, including Algeria, including Pakistan. And we have to get ourselves organized not to let small mafias of killers, of cheaters, of liars to disturb our life. They can appear unexpectedly at every place. They can endanger every group of people, and we shouldn't permit it to disturb our life as a human assembly.
Shimon Peres speaking to me a few minutes ago from Jerusalem. Well, joining me now is Daniel Plesch, a senior security analyst for the Royal United Services Institute. Welcome. Now, we all know that there's no way of stopping a determined terrorist. Yet, the questions, of course, are being asked tonight. Were these attacks, 4 of them, preventable?
Well, security services have to deal with warnings all the time, but there will be a real examination of what the warnings were this time and what more could have been done. Also, frankly, in the United States, it is very easy to travel around on domestic airliners. The level of security is not what you get on an international flight. And also in America's public buildings, security is very, very lax. Even I remember at the recent NATO summit in Washington, it was shocking how easy it was to get about.
How are the American secret services, intelligence agencies, how are they rated?
Well, they have more resources than anybody else in the world, but Americans, frankly, have an enormous self-confidence that, frankly, leaves them deaf sometimes and blind to what is going on around them. The idea that the American way is the only way sometimes can be America's undoing.
Now, you've lived in Washington, you know the American mentality well. How are they going to be reacting to this? I mean, they spend billions and billions on their defense budget.
Yes.
And yet, tonight, they look curiously defenseless.
Well, there will clearly be massive questions about, frankly, how you can spend so much defending yourself and end up so vulnerable. And part of the problem, frankly, is that it's the big-ticket items, the glamorous items, Star Wars, aircraft carriers, that get all the attention. It's the unglamorous things, like counter-terrorism or minesweepers, that are so vital to keeping us safe, that don't have the glamour, don't get you made into a general or an admiral, that don't get the investment.
What about the response now? I mean, President Bush is going to be under enormous pressure, isn't he, to do something. And instinctively, one would guess that he wants to do something, to hit back whoever might be responsible.
Well, it's interesting. Coming up on the bus here, I was with some, by chance, with some flight attendants from an American airline, and their immediate reaction was, we just hope our president doesn't do anything rash now to make things worse. So I think it won't simply be a quick gun response.
But he's got to do something, hasn't he? I mean, public opinion will demand it.
Yes, but if the question is whether we get the right people. And what is done, I'm sure, will not simply be cruise missiles and aircraft. There will be a demand to put American forces on the ground to get whoever...
Like Afghanistan?
I wouldn't be surprised if they go into bin Laden's camps. That will be the sort of pressure that will be on. Not cruise missile attacks.
Daniel Plesch, for the moment, thank you very much. Now, let's go to New York and our correspondent, Steve Evans. Steve, I know you were in the World Trade Center when all this happened. Just explain to us, would you, what you saw and heard?
It's more what I felt, really. I was at the base of the second tower, if you like, the second tower that was hit on a busy, obviously a busy morning. If you wanted to choose timing, that would be the time to do it, 9:15, in a complex of buildings where 50,000 people work. There was an explosion. I didn't think it was an explosion, but the base of the building shook. I felt it shake. I thought, well, that can't be right. It felt like a big weight, a construction weight, falling from a great, great height. People moved out very, very calmly, no screaming or anything like that, but you could see moisture on their eyes and you could hear fear you could hear the fear in their voices. And then when we were outside, the second explosion happened, and there were then a series of explosions. You can see these pictures. The thing that strikes me about these pictures is that some of those emergency vehicles were clearly there when later debris rained on them. So one of the things that happened was basically the structure, the engineering, if you like, of the structure wasn't apparent to the security forces. We are now, what are we, 8 hours after that. The operation goes on. We can only wonder at the kind of damage, the kind of human damage which was caused by those explosions, those series of explosions.
How long after the attacks by the planes did the buildings actually collapse? And what happened in that intervening period?
The buildings eventually collapsed, but they collapsed about 2 hours later. There was an explosion when the aircraft hit one of the towers, and then another explosion about, I don't know, 10 minutes later when a second aircraft hit the second tower. But the building then collapsed about 2 hours later. What we're now getting is, this city is now eerie. The avenue behind me in Midtown has been closed off. People are shocked. I know it's a kind of a cliche that people say this about these kind of things, if you can imagine this kind of thing. But people are literally stunned, speechless by this whole thing. People are digesting it. There may well be some kind of appetite for revenge. The television programs are using captions like "America under attack." That word, Pearl Harbor, keeps cropping up. The president's statement says, "The resolve of our great nation is being tested. Make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test." The mood is, as I say, stunned into silence. There are some angry people about. There was a bit of what we British call the Dunkirk spirit. People literally out in the street calling for the public to give blood. It's a very mixed emotion.
Stephen Evans in New York, thank you very much. Well, let's try and gauge Arab reaction now. We're joined on the line by our correspondent Frank Gardner from Cairo. What is the official and the unofficial reaction? How are people reacting in the street, Frank?
Well, they're very different, Philip. It may come as a shock, but on the streets, certainly in the Palestinian refugee camps all across the Middle East, there's been jubilation, chanting, cheering, celebratory gunfire. People have been handing out sweets. They're ecstatically happy. They're saying now at last America is having a taste of the same sort of suffering that we, the Palestinians, have had. At an official level, it's very different. Governments have unanimously condemned this. Of course, they're quite appalled by it. It shocked everybody, and it worries them about their own safety. President Mubarak went on air very quickly afterwards, offered his sympathies to the American people. Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian leader, was very quick to condemn it. He called it a horrific, an unbelievable disaster. Others have called it a horrific beyond imagination. Iraq so far has been silent.
Now that you talk about the jubilation in the streets, especially among Palestinians, to what extent is that representative, do you think, of Arab opinion?
It's the open expression of joy, I think, is marginal. Those are amongst the sort of the hard-bitten Palestinians who have just given up on the peace process. They're fed up with America continually backing Israel in their eyes, and they feel that America has got what it deserved. But I think that the vast majority of Arabs do feel a lot of sympathy for the victims. They are appalled by it. Certainly here in Egypt, the largest Arab country, the streets are almost empty. Everybody is glued to their television stations. Intellectuals condemn it. The middle class, many of the middle classes, the professionals condemn it. But I think a lot of people do feel, well, America had it coming, because it simply, in Arab eyes, doesn't listen to Arab opinion. It is blind to Arab opinion when it comes to the Arab-Israeli dispute. And Arabs feel that it's been backing, for too long it's been backing Israel, and now they feel that this is the reward it gets.
You seem to be implying that there's a strong suspicion then in the Middle East that there was a Middle East dimension to these attacks.
Well, interestingly, what's just come out is the first edition of the Morning Press here in Cairo, and Al Akhbar, which is one of the main papers. The editorial there says Israel